Before explaining and showing the menu system, how to control especially the exposure of this camera, first of all, let me just quickly overview what buttons do we have here. Here is a toggle switch which can be used to use this ring either for zooming or focusing. Usually I prefer to have it on focusing, because when this button, this AF/MF, is pressed, it changes back and forth between manual and autofocus. And the zoom rocker is perfectly fine for zooming, and also there is a zooming possibility on the touch screen too, so that's why I think using this lens for zooming is not that important, at least not the way I am using this camera. This AF/MF button is especially important because there is a very nifty and excellent focusing function on this camera, and practically on every Sony camera. It is called spot focusing. That is, when you have a touch screen, you can enable this spot focusing function. I will show quickly how it can be used. And then if you want quickly come back the spot focusing to full autofocus, this is the way to do it, because when you use spot focusing, then when the focus is established, the camera actually changes over to manual focus. So going back to full autofocus, the quickest way is just to press this button and then it jumps back to autofocus. The reason I mentioned this upfront, because when I'm explaining how to use this spot focusing, then I will mention that now I'm pressing AF/MF button to jump out from the spot focusing feature and going back to full auto focus. That's the main feature. Of course, if you are not in this spot focusing function, then just simply using pressing the MF, it brings you to a manual focus, and then of course you can use this lens ring to adjust the focus. The buttons here are this manual button. This is terribly important, because when you press this manual button, there are a number of functions, actually not a number of, a couple of functions, features can be assigned to this manual button. So if you, by default, it is set to exposure, and what does it mean? That this dial is used to change the actual values of certain value, the values on the screen, which is configured. For example, when you press this manual button and then the exposure values are highlighted, then you can increase and decrease and change the exposure, I mean overexpose or underexpose. That function is very similar to AE shift. That is auto exposure shift function. In photography we usually call it exposure compensation. So this AE shift is exactly the same as exposure compensation, and also this exposure, which has this function. And this camera supports both AE shift as well as exposure, so two kinds of exposure control. I will explain it to you. I've never seen any YouTube video which even tries to explain what is the difference in usage between the two. So they are definitely very similar. The other two buttons are for controlling if the iris or a gain or shutter speed are fully manual or auto. So that is, and also one thing, some it's a very nifty feature that there is this very small dot here. And then the reason is that when you hold the camera in your left hand, usually if you are a right-handed or whatever, so I always have it something like that, and I use my left hand thumb to control that. That is this way. Then this dot gives you a hint where you are located in this button row. And that's why I suggest that even when the camera screen is open, you have to practice and learn blindfolded operate. If you don't practice enough, then definitely it's your fault. It's not the camera's fault. This camera was designed, in my opinion, excellently designed. Actually, this screen doesn't prevent your thumbs to control and operate these buttons, but definitely it's a total primitive and uneducated, unprofessional way that you have to look at the buttons. It's so childish. No, you have to practice with your camera enough that blindfolded you should be able to locate, and that's why this tiny dot here, protrusion dot or whatever you call it, this one is a very big help. That one button behind the dot is the shutter, one button just next to the dot is the gain, and then the next button forward is the iris, and then also there is a protrusion here. So if you go beyond the protrusion, the manual button is there. So that is, there are enough physical hints on your system how to navigate. So if your fingers are sensitive enough, you should be able to control. Just practice enough. And also after the manual, just go forward, and then here you go, you can control and then press the manual button. This is the iris, and then the gain, and then the shutter without looking at. So shutter, gain, iris, manual, and of course even when you are on the lens, that's a bit trickier, that you should be able to practice also when your screen is open. You should be able to locate the AF. You see the manual. So when I press now the AF MF button, now the camera is in manual focus. That's why this F and the hand means that the focus is manual. When I press it again, it goes to autofocus. So when I just here you go, now I am in completely off. And then when I press it again to AF MF, then blindfolded, it jumps back to autofocus. So that's the level. You should be able to control the camera without opening your eyes. Yeah, definitely. All the buttons, you should be able to locate them all. There could be, of course, a couple of exceptions, which you don't definitely have to learn to operate blindfolded. And these are the buttons behind the screen, and these are the power button. Power button is perfectly fine if you, anyhow, you know what is power button. Normally you don't use it, because when you open or close the screen, the power is switched off. When you open it, the power is on. However, if you want to disable power because of some reason, just press the power button and then you unpowered your camera. The display controls some aspects of the display. Night shot, I never use night shot so far. And white balance is, in videography, white balance is terribly important, because we don't shoot with cameras like this with raw image, Therefore, the whole white balance thing should be set, everything within the camera. Actually, this whole videography, it's very important and terribly important to set up the scene and everything to minimize the need for manipulate the image later when post-processing. So that's why white balance has a direct button. I'm not going to cover white balance in this video. And the program auto exposure, actually when you press it, all your auto exposure jumps over to automatic, and then this camera has really decent auto exposure algorithms. So when I was working with it, I loved it. For an auto exposure system, it's perfectly fine. The only thing that you keep in mind, and then always immediately you should be able, that the iris and the gain control is perfect. So the shutter speed. This camera is trying the shutter speed in a reasonable value. Say if you have a 25 frame per second shutter, then the shutter speed would be around 50 and then maybe more, but definitely doesn't enforce 180 degrees rule. That is, just keep in mind, but anyway, the shutter speed values will be quite reasonable values. But anyway, so if you really want to stubbornly maintain your fixed shutter speed, say on this camera, this is a European version, we have here on this camera typically 25 frames per second. That is, if you want to manually keep the shutter at 50, 1/50th of a second, then you should set the shutter manual. And then this camera is really smart to maintain both of the other values, gain and iris, in an automated way. And then you can use this dial either in this exposure mode or AE shift, that is exposure control, or AE shift mode, both works fine, to underexpose or overexpose, depending on where you are turning your dial. Okay, and I don't know what this button is meant for, and this is just the SD card slot. We have here an HDMI cable slot. I think this is mini HDMI. Yes, this is mini, I think mini HDMI. And also I have here the headphone to control the audio. And the other side of the camera and of the back is again terribly important. We have here the power cable location. This is the start stop button, and this one very important. This camera has quite decent still image capability. It shoots only JPEG, no RAW, and there are two ways to change between photo and video. When you start your camera, it always starts with in video, because that's the main focus, the main feature of this camera. When you press the menu, then the first thing is shooting mode. You have two options, movie or photo. We have also high-speed rec, but I never used it. And this is the other option, is when you want quickly change between photo and video. This is the button, just press it and it changes quickly between these two modes. And then the reason I mentioned is photo, because in photo mode the image quality is really decent, 20 megapixel image quality, quite decent. This is a 1-inch sensor, So don't expect miracles, but as for a 1-inch sensor, definitely it takes better pictures. And then the lens is f2.5, so even the low light capabilities is quite decent. And this is the way you can take a photo. So even when you are in photo mode, you cannot use this button, the record button, to start to take a photo. You always have to use this photo. You have the option to take photos while recording video. I definitely don't recommend that. Image quality is absolutely unusable. So please use the photo mode if you want to take decent pictures from this camera. And this one is the multi-interface shoe. In my previous videos I explained how to use accessories on this camera. Yep, and there is one more quite weirdly located button here, actually on the other side of the lens barrel. This is the focus magnifier. This is especially useful when you are manually focusing, and I still am practicing. So if you hold the camera like so, then you can definitely try to use your experiment and practice to use your pinky. You see, your pinky to operate this button. But yeah, it's it definitely requires a lot of practice to be able. I don't shoot a lot manual focus, and quite often I just realized and recognized that my shooting position is typically not the typical video camera holding, but I prefer to use the camera like so. So either using the screen that way, or my favorite one on this camera, and one of the reason I went for this camera, this video camera, instead of using mirrorless cameras, because of this tilting electronic viewfinder. The viewfinder is big enough, the quality is quite decent. The resolution could have been better, but just remember, this is an 800 today, an 800 euro camera. I bought it off eBay, and then this was released in 2014. This is an 8 years old model, and at that time this electronic viewfinder was top of the class. Still very usable, absolutely. I'm wear glasses, so, and even then I can say that it's really an excellent viewfinder to use this camera. Anyway, and then so therefore that's normally my position, and when in this position I could have the option to use my index finger to operate this focus magnifier. And then this focus magnifier, the way it works is quite reasonable. When I click it, then if you click multiple times, it just magnifies back to a screen, and then when you click first, then touch the screen to, yes, the touch screen to magnify. Now I press this, and then this way I can any part of the, make sure just gentle tap this button, just here you go, something like that. And what is also nifty, that it also shows the actual focus distance. We have also additional input. This one is, this jack is for the microphone, and then this is a multi-function USB whatever, and this is especially for this remote control. By chance I have it here. This is the RMVS1 remote commander. This one is not the original Sony. This one is this. There is a Sony version of that, but this works also very well. The Sony version, of course, is a lot more expensive, but this one works quite decently, and it's a lot less expensive than the Sony version. Anyhow, and then the reason it could be reasonable and meaningful that when you use this camera on a tripod, and then typically a video camera tripod heads on actually video heads, they have a handle, and then you can somehow apply and attach this this commander. You know, this is a wired commander on the handle, and then you can start and stop recording, you can zoom. Yeah, so absolutely useful. So everything on next to your right hand, and you don't have to touch the camera. You can operate the whole recording on the handle using this tool. So yeah, that's to be used here on this remote. I think that was it.